One of our supporters, a contributor to the show, made a request that we review and respond to a video. And we always sort of take those requests and we move them to the front of the line and we focus on them, earlier than we would anything else, because the guy takes some of his resources and supports the channel. So for that, I appreciate it and I thank you, and that's awesome. And so we're going to honor that by taking your request to take a look at this video. The video that we're going to be taking a look at is a video by Tom Woods. Now, I always say that when I don't like doing the YouTube talking head back and forth takedown videos. So this is not going to be one of those. This is not Patrick Smith destroying Tom Woods on his belief in God. That's not it at all. We're going to watch it, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to show you how I analyze content, because every day of my life, in preparation for this show, and just in general, I consume large quantities of content, and when I'm analyzing something, I kind of want to show you how I do it. It involves usually taking notes. When I'm seriously focusing on some piece of content that I want to be challenged by, or to respond to, or to understand, I wanted to show you my process for that and just kind of let you see what I do and how I do it. And you know what? If my conclusions and responses to this video you think are flawed, put it in the comments. And if you're watching this later, and you know there's good arguments to be had here, I'm totally cool and open to having Tom Woods on the show to talk through it. That's fine. I'm not like super heated or trying to destroy anybody here. Tom Woods has put out a lot of excellent content, and I respect him for that. And so this is not some kind of cantankerous, absurd. This is not an insult. This is me taking somebody that is a thinker, a prominent thinker, and giving him the respect of analyzing the things he had to say. Like, it's one of the coolest things you guys could do for me is like listen to the things I say, analyze it, critique them, respond if you think I'm wrong. That's paying me respect, and I appreciate it. So I'm going to do that here with Tom today. Stuff I used to do to Yaron Brook before he melted babies. Oh, what? Sorry, what?
And before he said that to engage in a debate wasn't an endorsement with somebody. So,
yeah.
In fact, the engaging of debate is like to disagree and to say, I believe you are incorrect and this is why.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I don't think there's actually any video to this video, so I'm not really concerned with showing that to you. But I do have my notes here in case, and you're welcome to, stay up or stay hidden or whatever until you have something to say. That's fine.
I'll pop up. Yeah.
So he's going to be making a 34-minute case for the belief in God, or for the existence of God. And we're going to go through it. We're going to talk through it. Look, this is not my wheelhouse. I'm sort of anti-state primarily. Haven't spent a lot of time making these arguments, but I like to think that I have a sharp mind for some of this. And so I'm going to do the best I can. And let's see where it goes. Kaysen, I think, is very much more well-versed in this area. So I look forward to seeing what he has to say. He has not seen this video. I have. Anyway, so a lot of the first thing I do when I'm trying to take something seriously is I open a Word document or Notepad or something, and I take notes as people talk. And you can see this like back when I analyzed Yaron Brook's debate, where he said that anarchism allows for sex with children, and me just saying that has now triggered YouTube's algorithm, but I don't care. So yeah, it was an absurd claim, and when we listened to that debate, I took notes in the same way, and it's because it's important to show people's contradictions, and I think that will probably be useful in this video, and I hope it's useful to the supporter that asked me to do this. So here we go. Okay.
Welcome, everybody. It's Monday, October 27th, 2014, the beginning of another week of programming. And today I'm going to be talking to you by myself without a guest, and I'm going to cover the God question. This comes up quite a bit among libertarians. In fact, it's hard to imagine a libertarian conference without an after-hours debate on the subject of God. So I wanted to raise this issue because there have been a number of people over the years, very good supporters of mine, who have said things along the lines of, that Woods is a swell guy and everything, but my goodness, is he terrible. when it comes to God. He believes in God. So, well, everybody's got his own blind spot to deal with, and we'll look the other way for this on this one deviation from Woods. So I get this kind of a lot. Well, maybe not a lot, but I get it enough that I felt like I should devote an episode to it. Now, I'm not saying by any means that everyone who is agnostic or atheist has a kind of superiority complex like this. Certainly, I know many such people who are quite respectful and with whom I've had very good friendships over the years. But we all know, whether atheist or theist, that there are people out there who have this kind of attitude that, well, gosh, some people seem to have faith, and I'm just a scientist, so there's just no way I can be sucked into this nonsense. And these people might just as easily be worshiping the flying spaghetti monster. It's equally plausible. So I just thought, I think I've just got to take this on. So that's what this episode is about. I'm going to show you that I am not an idiot for believing in God. There's actually a reasonable positioned argument to be made here. And again, I'm in no way, I don't want this to distract attention from what I'm about to do, I'm in no way saying that everybody who disagrees with me is either an idiot or disrespectful or rude or superior. I'm in no way saying that. But there is a sliver, there's a group out there that does have this sort of attitude. But let me start off by saying, if you have advanced this idea that people who believe in God, really, they ought to just go ahead and believe in the flying spaghetti monster, there's just as much evidence for it, don't do that. Okay, don't say that, because you're basically making a fool of yourself. And I'm not trying to insult you. I'm looking out for you. I'm looking out for you. Other people who share your views probably think you've really stuck it to those people by laughing at them using the flying spaghetti monster example. But by the end of this episode, you'll see how preposterous that is. You'll see that anybody who is familiar with the work of Thomas Aquinas, for example, will listen to this and say, the flying spaghetti monster argument, and say, well, another teenager who reads nothing and thinks he knows everything. Now, the problem that's faced here is that the chances that you have as a college undergraduate of encountering Thomistic metaphysics and Thomistic philosophy at any length is about the chance you have of encountering Austrian economics. And therefore, you wind up with people coming out of school thinking they know all about a particular area when they've never even been exposed to a really key school of thought. It's like Paul Krugman, who thinks the Austrians are unscientific, and I can't believe I have to debate with these people, and yet the guy can't even be bothered to state correctly what the Austrians believe about business cycles. Well, likewise, I've encountered so many people who are going to lecture me about how irrational I am to believe in God, who have absolutely no idea what the argument from the unmoved mover is. They have no idea, never heard of it, or if they have heard of it, they think it has to do with one billiard ball hitting another billiard ball, and then one moving thing makes another thing move. They think it's that. They have no idea what Thomas and Aristotle mean by motion, none at all, and yet they're nevertheless going to launch into tirades against people, even though they frankly are not entitled to an opinion until they have acquainted themselves with the sources. So,
not entitled to an opinion. So, Kaysen, if you have any commentary on the condescension from atheists, now would probably be a good time for that. I've certainly seen it.
Yeah, sure. It exists. It's out there. But that's with all people. I would mention that typically if I'm talking to a skeptic, that's different than somebody who is very versed in a particular religion. In my case, it's typically Christianity, although I have talked to some Jews who they don't have the same proselytizing kind of like aspect to the religion, because in the South you get a lot of evangelical Christians. But as far as condescension, I mean, that goes both ways, so it's really a non-starter other than, yeah, it exists. I agree, sure.
Agree, and I can empathize with sort of both sides. Like one side is, a really strong believer in something, and so when it's questioned, they react emotionally. Of course, that's what humans do. And then the other side, I can empathize with, like when you realize that a large quantity of your moral framework was based on faulty reasoning. That kind of pisses you off. You're like, what? Why the hell do so many people believe this? To the point where it was part of my upbringing. It was taught to me as 100% true facts, and it affects so many relationships and things. And when you get to that point, and you realize it, and you lose a lot of your relationships in your life because religious people no longer want to associate with you. I think that was part of what happened to you, right, Kason? You lost some of your relationships when you sort of analyzed the reason and evidence and truth behind this. That it's a very emotional thing on both
90%.
sides.
90%. Emotional for both sides. Yeah, 90% plus of my social life was just obliterated. I was asked not to return to the church I was attending. And I wasn't necessarily asserting anything. I was just asking questions of religious instructors because I wanted to be a youth pastor, and I wanted to go to seminary, and I wanted to lead and instruct children in the ways of my beliefs. And whenever I got down to actually reading the Bible, that's what brought up a lot of questions for me, like reading it start to finish, not just hanging out in the New Testament and hanging out in specific stories like in Matthew, like let's hang out with the teaching of the Beatitudes or anything like that. It's like, no, let's read through Exodus and question the validity of killing infant sons and the ethics around that. And that was a big question for me, that no one was able to offer up a framework that would be able to, like, for example, in Exodus, Moses, the Israelites, they're in bondage in Egypt, and Moses has been sent by God to free them, and he goes to Pharaoh and he says, hey, let my people go, or else I'm going to do this. And it starts off with a minor plague, and it increases until it's literally killing the firstborn son of everybody in Egypt. And each time, in the translation that I read, it read that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. And whenever I read it through Strong's dictionary, which is like kind of a like, let's go back to the original language and what are all the different ways you could read this, it was basically subverting the concept of free will. Like, it removes the ability of choice. And it's like, I can't imagine the animosity we would feel if I was able to say, hey, Patrick, don't do this thing, but then I inject you with a drug that makes you do that thing, like biomechanically. I don't think I would then be justified in hitting you or shooting you over doing that thing, or, to make it more accurate to the story, killing your child.
Yeah, like
that would be evil.
Even if you didn't interfere with the Pharaoh's free will and interfere with his decision to let Moses' people go, that still doesn't justify killing babies. Like, it's like none of the ethics of that story makes sense. Anyway,
it requires the collectivization of everybody, just like Yaron Brooks' position around the nuclear bombing of Japan.
Nailed it. Yes. And so anyway, I guess the thing I just wanted to point out was that when you're on the other side of that, both sides, you realize that there's an emotional reaction. There's emotions involved. Like there's anger there, resentment there, hurt there, lost connections there. And so when you get condescension from either side, because it definitely exists on either side, you just kind of have to be a little empathetic to that. You have to understand where that's coming from. Now, granted, Kojal says, because people like Dawkins spend their entire life acting like complete pricks, there's a cult of personality around him. That can and is probably also true. People are going to be pricks in public because it gets them more views. I mean, that's just how public views work. Like, if I was a real prick here today on this video, I guarantee you this video would get way, way, way more views. It might even go viral amongst libertarians. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. Even if it costs me views, I'm still going to be nice and polite because that's just how I want discourse to go, you know?
there's two things just around Dawkins. One, there's an entire series of him that I think you can YouTube Dawkins free or something like that was produced by BBC's Channel 4, where he goes and learns the core tenets of a whole bunch of different religions and kind of takes part in them for a day or two. So that's a lot more than most people give him credit for, I guess. And then also, like, in a debate, yeah, he's super condescending whenever someone is advocating a particular thing. But just Google Richard Dawkins love letters. It's like a YouTube video. Not you, Patrick, but just anybody who's watching. You can see the fan mail that he gets from believers where they're hoping he'll burn in hell and whatnot. So that's, I suppose it's kind of a double-edged sword, right?
I just try and give both people on both sides of the benefit of the doubt. Like the guy that came up to me in the park, he's trying to save my soul. That's pretty cool of him. If he thinks that that's what's going to happen, why wouldn't you be out there trying to save people? Like, that's a really good thing for him to do. Appreciate you. Thank you. Likewise, if you think that, there's a mass superstition out there, gee, I wonder what other mass superstitions might be out there. You might spend part of your lifespan trying to expose people to the fact that it's not there, and to show people all of the negative repercussions of that false superstition. Anyway, all right, so let's continue. Stephen Mulvey with the super chat. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you. 5 in ZD. I think that's New Zealand, right? Is he talking the Christian God or a God in the generic sense? I guess we'll find out as we go, but I suspect that if he's making Thomas Aquinas's arguments, it's going to be the Christian God. But this is a deeper topic than a simple answer like that. There's many layers. For example, and we'll probably get to it, but Aquinas was building on Aristotle's arguments, and Aristotle's arguments, and we'll talk about this later, he was making arguments about physics and wasn't necessarily even trying to prove a God with his arguments, and so that was taken and done by Aquinas later. Anyway, let's move on.
What I'm going to do today relies heavily on the work of my friend Ed Feser, F-E-S-E-R. Now, Ed and I don't agree on everything. We have areas of important disagreement, but he's a very smart guy, and he's a friend. And I've been a student of his indirectly over the years. So let me share with you one.
I'll say that if Dawkins is a dick, so is Feser. Like, he in his critiques of anybody that rebuts him, he doesn't pull punches either. So that's just evidence of cantankerousness on both sides. That's fine.
Argument for the existence of God. But it takes a while to build up to it because I need to introduce some terminology. Thomas Aquinas, of course, we're talking about the 13th century figure, roughly 1225 to 1274, and we associate with him something called the Quinque Viae, which is Latin for 5 ways. These are 5 ways of demonstrating the existence of God. And in the Summa Theologica, he gives you a little taste of these 5 ways, but he really develops the argument at much, much greater length in the Summa Contra Gentiles. And incidentally, I have a number of people who follow me who also have liked Richard Dawkins, author of The God Delusion, on Facebook. Well, just one difficulty with Dawkins, apart from the fact that his own colleagues have called him an embarrassment to the new atheism, is that he actually says that Aquinas, even though he may think he's proven the existence of God, even if he hasn't shown us that the God he has proven to exist must be just one, or must be all-powerful, or have all these other attributes. Well, no, Aquinas doesn't really do that in the Summa Theologica. That's true. But he spends hundreds of pages on this subject in the Summa Contra Gentiles. I don't think it's too much to ask that people who are going to make a public argument on a subject of great importance at least be acquainted with the basic facts of the matter. All right, so what I'm going to do is give you kind of a modern adaptation of Aquinas' first way, the unmoved mover. And let's begin by understanding, what does Aquinas mean by motion? And Aquinas is thinking in an Aristotelian sense. He's thinking of motion as moving from or going from potentiality to actuality, or in the older terminology, from potency to act. That's what Aquinas means by motion, the reduction of potency to act. Now, we'll probably use the terms potentiality and actuality because they're more familiar to us. But what does he mean by that? Well, think about when you put your cold leftovers from the refrigerator, you put them in the oven. And then you take them out of the oven and they're hot. Well, that dinner had the potential to be hot, and that potential was actualized by the oven.
I want to point out, because he hasn't really made it clear, and maybe he's about to, that he's talking about Aristotle's work on physics. These words that he's using are from the physics of Aristotle's time. So obviously not in line with reality in terms of how things actually work. That's why you haven't really ever heard like a physicist talk about, motion in terms of actuality and potentiality. It's because no one thinks like that anymore. Those words aren't really used anymore because they don't really line up well with reality. Kind of as evidenced by, what was the example in the microwave just now? I missed, what type of food was it in the microwave? I don't know, whatever, it doesn't matter. But
I think you just said leftovers.
Leftover, okay, fine. Yeah, so he said the leftovers have the potentiality of becoming hot, and it's actuated by the microwave. So what a strange way of thinking about the physics of the situation. Like there's no energy contained in the leftovers, so do they really have potential energy? Like, potential energy is a modern word. Like, we understand what potential energy means because that's modern physics. But the way he's using it is in the old Aristotelian physics way. And look, I can read from Aristotle right here. It's like book 8 of his physics work. I can read out of it later if we want, if I see a good opportunity for it. I have it pulled up. It's right here, ready to go. But this is physics from a long time ago. So these words don't the reason why this whole argument that he's probably about to make for the next 20 minutes, it's going to be using potentiality and actuality. It's used in a way that doesn't really map to reality anymore. But let's continue.
So it moves from a condition of potentiality to actuality. Or think about a person growing. A person grows from being 4 feet tall to 5 feet tall. Well, that person had the potential to be 5 feet tall when 4 feet tall. And then that potentiality was actualized through eating and good nutrition and so on and so forth. Or move. So
the potentiality to actuality thing is now talking about like potential possible future states, which is, another thing.
Moving from A to B, moving from place A to place B. Somebody moving from A to B has the potential to be at B and then actualizes that potential. That potential is actualized. Or think about maybe a part of your bicycle rusting. Well, the bicycle had the potential to rust, and then that potential was actualized through various ways. That's what we mean by potentiality and actuality. Okay, these are things that we see all the time. All the time. We see potency being reduced to act. Potentialities becoming actualities. Now let's also...
It's worth pointing out, and this is Aquinas taking Aristotle's work, but right now we're talking about something that came from Aristotle. Aristotle was trying to describe how motion works in physics of his time period. Some people call it Aristotelian physics. The actuality of potentiality was an attempt at sort of scientifically explaining physics. But also worth pointing out is that back then it was thought to be true that every object had some sort of inherent built-in purpose. They also thought that like the stars and the planets and moons moved through space perfectly, and also that these heavenly bodies were eternal, like everlasting. So they thought a lot of interesting things, and some of these arguments are motivated from those things. Anyway, it bears pointing out that this was not intended by Aristotle to be like an argument for God. Aquinas later tried to do that. Anyway, moving on.
Note here at the outset, what Thomas Aquinas is not saying. Here are a couple of arguments Aquinas is not making. He is not saying the universe couldn't have gotten started unless God had set everything in motion a long time ago. He is absolutely not saying that. He is not talking about events far in the distant past. He is not talking about that. So get that out of your head. He's talking about events taking place in the here and now. That's how he's demonstrating the existence of God. Not that there needed to be a God to get the ball rolling. That is not the argument Aquinas is making here in the first way, the unmoved mover. Secondly, he is not saying everything has a cause. I can't believe how many people I run into who think that's the argument for the existence of God, that everything has a cause, and so God must be the cause of everything. They actually think that's what religious believers are saying, that everything has a cause, and so God must be the cause of everything. And then they come back with, well, then what caused God? And then they triumphantly march around the room as if they've won the argument. But no one has ever said that.
That is Aquinas' argument, so this is very interesting. I mean, not in its full, not in its entirety by any stretch. Like, he was right that Aquinas wrote hundreds and hundreds of pages on this, but it's interesting that he said that that's not the argument, because it seems like that's going to be the argument, but let's see where it goes. So he says the argument is, he's not saying that everything has a cause, and so God must have been the cause of everything. Everything has a cause, and so God must have been the cause of everything. Okay, and he said no one is saying that. Didn't that dude, the dude that approached me in the park, Kaysen, he was learning that rhetoric from a guy, and I can't remember his name. Do you remember?
Ray Comfort's The Way of the Master.
Yeah, I mean, that's a guy that's taught this technique to a lot of people, and the argument that, you heard that guy in the park basically saying, like, everything has to be built by somebody. Like, who built? We see that building and we know that that building had a builder. And I was like, well, I challenged him on it, and he's like, well, what else could it be besides God? I'm not sure that no one is making this argument. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people make this argument. Anyway.
There is nobody in the tradition of Western theism of any significance whatsoever who has made that argument.
Okay, that's a different statement. I don't know if you'd consider Ray Comfort somebody of significance, and anyway, whatever.
And I mean going all the way down to the 20th century to Reginald Garrigou-Lagrange. There is nobody who made that argument. Because, of course, that argument does open them to the objection, well, then what caused God? Oh, ho, 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 ho. Right, that's why they're not making that argument. And moreover...
Oh, okay, come on, man. Like, a lot of people make this argument, and what caused God is a pretty valid rebuttal, but okay.
A critic could say, well, look, if God doesn't have a cause, well, then couldn't we just as easily say maybe the universe doesn't have a cause? If God didn't need one, maybe the universe didn't need one, and there's your argument in tatters. Well, thankfully for Aquinas, that's not what he was saying to start with, so we don't need to deal with that uninformed objection. Here's the argument Aquinas is making, and it's an astonishing argument. He's saying that the universe could not continue in existence, not come into existence. The universe could not continue in existence right now, and change could not occur right now without God's keeping it in existence and being the source of change right now. All right, let's go into some examples. We've got the ideas of motion, meaning, or change, meaning going from potency to act, potentiality to act. God's keeping it in existence and being the source of change right now. All right, let's go into some examples. We've got the ideas of motion, meaning, or change, meaning going from potency to act, potentiality to actuality. Your dinner is potentially hot, now it's actually hot, and so on. Also, another Aristotelian idea, because of course Aquinas is very much a follower, a student, and expounder and developer of Aristotle. Another Aristotelian idea that he's going to employ is that no potential can actualize itself. Your dinner does not heat itself. No matter how much you stare at it, no matter how much you hope that it will become hot, it must be made actual. Its potential for being hot must be actualized by something outside itself. That's another Aristotelian idea. Another Aristotelian idea, we don't have to get into the
this is Aristotelian
doctrine
physics.
Actualized by something outside itself. That's another Aristotelian idea. Another Aristotelian idea, we don't have to get into the Aristotelian doctrine of the four causes. I do talk about.
I'm just going to rewind to make sure I get the arguments correct.
Its potential for being hot must be actualized by something outside itself. That's another Aristotelian idea. Another Aristotelian idea, we don't have to get into the Aristotelian doctrine of the four causes. I do talk about that in my Western Civ course at tomwoodshomeschool.com. But for now, I'll just say this. The immediate efficient cause of a thing is simultaneous with it. So in other words, imagine your friend's car is stuck and you have to push that car to help him get it out. The immediate cause of the car being pushed is the application of the hands and force of the person. But for Aristotle and for Aquinas, the pushing with your hands and then the car moving out of the rut that it's in, these are the same thing. It's not like two actions are going on here, that my hands are moving forward and the car is moving forward. This is all one thing that's occurring simultaneously. And then just one more concept in order to proceed and make the argument. We need to distinguish between two different kinds of series, an accidentally ordered series and an essentially ordered series. For an accidentally ordered series, the classic case would be a father who begets a son, and then his son begets his own son, and that son begets his own son, etc. The reason this is an accidentally ordered series is that the son can beget a son even if his father is dead. His father's continuing presence and continuing action is not necessary for this series to continue. The father's son has his own independent power to beget a son, and it does not rely on the continued existence of the father. So the father could drop dead, but the son can still have children. That's what we call an accidentally ordered series. Now,
Voluntary Dan says that argument is very common. Yeah, it certainly is. He added a caveat that nobody prominent or something like that was saying it, which I find hard to believe, but okay, I don't care to argue that. Constant actualization equals food always gets colder. Heating it up is not actualization, but resistance to it. Interesting.
On the other hand, let's consider the classic Thomistic example of a stick and a stone. And let's imagine that you're walking down the street, you see a stick, you pick it up, and then you happen to see a stone, and you're bored as you're walking, so you use that stick to push the stone along as you walk. So what's happening here is that your hand is pushing the stick, which pushes the stone. Now, whenever the last part of a series like this, the movement of the stone, exists, then the earlier parts, the motion of the hand and the stick, exist. The stone moves only because the hand and the twig move it. The hand, of course, is what really moves the stone, right? The stick is just the instrument by which the hand is moving the stone. This is what we call an essentially ordered series. Because unlike with the fathers and the sons, in this case, the later members of the series have no independent powers of motion of their own. A son has an independent power to beget a son, but a stone has no independent power of motion. A stick has no independent power of motion. So although a son can beget a son even though the first father is gone, a stone cannot move without that hand pushing it, or pushing it through the instrument of a stick. So their ability to move and to move other things derives from the first member of the series. In an essentially ordered series, the series couldn't continue without these earlier members, the stick, and particularly the first member, the hand. Now, an accidentally ordered series does not need to have a beginning, but an essentially ordered series does. Now, I'm not going to go into why an accidentally ordered series doesn't have to have a beginning, but we can see that an essentially ordered series, like a stone being moved by a stick, being pushed by a hand, that does have to have a beginning. Now, an essentially ordered series, again, is not concerned with things going back in time. It involves a sequence occurring in the present moment, a stone being moved right now, by a stick being pushed right now, by a hand pushing right now. So each member depends simultaneously upon another, which depends simultaneously upon still another. We're not talking about a temporal sequence of events. We're talking about one change that's going on simultaneously with a series of members. If the last member of the series exists, the movement of the stone, then a first member must exist. The stone moves because the stick moves, and the stick moves because the hand moves. The stone's potentiality for movement is actualized by the stick, and the stick's potentiality for movement is actualized by the hand. But when we think about it, even the hand is not really the first member. The hand moves because the arm moves. The arm moves because the right muscles flex. The muscles flex because certain neurons fire. And that in turn depends on the firing of other neurons, which depends on the state of the nervous system, which depends on its current molecular structure, which depends on electromagnetism, gravitation, etc. So the hand does not have an independent power of motion either. So, suppose I cut my hand off. I chop my hand off, and my dead hand does not have any independent power of motion. So if I were to say, I have a couple things I want to do at once. I want to keep this stick moving this stone. So I'll chop off my hand, and I'll leave my hand pushing the stick that pushes the stone while I go eat a sandwich with my other hand. Well, of course, that's not going to work. So the actualization of one potential depends on the simultaneous actualization of another potential, which depends on the simultaneous actualization of another potential, and so on. Without a first member, there would be no series, because it is only the first member that is really doing anything, strictly speaking. The later members are just instruments of the first member.
So this is like the first paragraph of Book 8 from Aristotle's Physics. Was there ever a becoming of motion before which it had no being, and is it perishing again so as to leave nothing in motion? Or are we to say that it never had any becoming and is not perishing, but always was and will be? Is it, in fact, an immortal, never-failing property of things that are, a sort of life, as it were, to all naturally constituted things? And then he kind of goes on to, I think, argue against that with his, with the motion requiring a first mover. So yeah, this is from his physics work, first of all. And he has another book called Metaphysics where he also makes some arguments along these lines, to be fair. But
remember, take for another example, a caboose. You see a caboose moving. What's pulling the caboose? Well, you see a freight car pulling it. But a freight car can't be the explanation. A freight car does not have an independent power of motion.
We got it.
So even if you had an infinite number of freight cars, that would still not explain the movement of the caboose. You have to have an engine car. Or likewise, a paintbrush painting a fence. What's making that paintbrush paint that fence? The brush handle? Even if the brush handle were...
Hey, Cubes, good to see you over on Float. Nice to have you.
Infinitely long, brush handles have no independent powers of movement. There must be a first mover. So there must be a first mover at the beginning of any essentially ordered causal series in order for...
Essentially ordered causal series. There must be a first mover. Essentially ordered causal series. Should probably copy this to the clipboard. I bet I'm going to paste this a lot. Cubes over on Float. Cubes, are you associated with the Cubes operating system?
For that series to exist at all. Now, what do we know without a doubt about the first mover in these series? We know that if an alleged first mover is itself moving or changing, it can't be the first mover. The first mover has to be itself unmoved, or to use the more modern vernacular, unchanging. Now, why is that? Well, because remember, nothing can actualize its own potentiality. Potentialities are actualized by another. Well, if something is moving or changing, then its potentiality is being actualized. But if its potentiality is being actualized, some other thing must be actualizing that potentiality, must be acting upon it to actualize that potentiality. So then this other thing must be the first mover. But if it itself is moving or changing, then its own potentiality, one of its own potentialities, is being actualized by still another. Well, this can't go on forever, or there would be no essentially ordered causal series.
Okay. I think that was the linchpin of the argument that he will not be able to justify. Let's hear that again.
So there must be the first mover. But if it itself is moving or changing, then its own potentiality, one of its own potentialities, is being actualized by still another. Well, this can't go on forever, or there would be no essentially ordered causal series. So therefore, the first mover in such a series must itself be unmoved or be unchanging, so that there is no infinite regress. And now we see, of course, Aquinas is not saying everything
Okay, I'm pretty sure my entire counter argument is going to be centered around these two sentences right there.
Has a cause. He's saying that changes have causes, that the movement from potentiality to actuality has a cause. Yes, but not absolutely everything. The first mover does not change, does not have potentiality to actualize, because otherwise it couldn't be the first mover. We would still lack a full explanation for what's going on in an essentially ordered causal series. So the only way to stop the regress, lack a full explanation for what's going on in an essentially ordered causal series. So the only way to stop the regress and arrive at a first member is with a being that, unlike all the other members of the series, does not have to be actualized by anything else. So this being must be pure actuality, or pure act, with no potentiality whatever. And with no potentiality or no potency to realize, this being could not move or change, because any movement, any change is itself a movement from potency to act. But this being is pure act. So it has no unrealized potentiality, no unactualized potentiality to actualize. So it can't move or change. And this, says Aquinas, is God. God is...
All right. I mean, let's continue on just to make sure there's nothing else.
Is what makes change possible here and now. He is the final terminating point of every essentially ordered causal series. The logic of the matter demands it. Now, Aquinas, I mean, you can even go a lot farther than this and say that it's not just that God makes change possible, God actually keeps the universe in existence at every moment. Now, that's a much more complicated argument, but the point is there's an even stronger claim to be made than the one that I've made here. Now, right away, we can automatically dismiss the flying spaghetti monster. Immediately dismiss the flying spaghetti monster. Why? Well, let's just take the first word. I'll get to spaghetti later. But let's take the first word, flying. Flying involves the reduction of potency to act. A flying spaghetti monster that flies was actually here and potentially over there. But now that he goes over there, he's actually over there. his potential to be over there has now been actualized. So that means you're dealing with a being that had potentiality to be actualized. This being is not pure act and therefore can't remotely qualify to be God according to the Thomistic framework. So I've now dismissed the flying spaghetti monster in, what was that, 15 seconds? 20 seconds? Don't say that anymore. You just look ridiculous. Okay, I mean, if you have an argument to make sure it's an informed one. Or think about these arguments. Be honest enough to look at what the other side of the argument is saying. Now, we'll get in a minute to why a spaghetti monster, why spaghetti also rules it out. Now, I know it seems like, why are you taking this so seriously? Well, because people really, I find, think they've really got us with this snarky little response, but it's just so bad. It's so bad of an argument that it needs to be stomped on repeatedly.
Okay, that's the exact same kind of attitude you get from atheists. It's so bad. We need to be really rough in our dismissal and our rebuttals.
Okay, so now let's see, how does Aquinas then derive the divine attributes? He'll say, I've shown that God is pure act, that there...
Okay, so we're kind of beginning a second argument. So at this point, he believes that he has sort of proven the existence of God, God being this thing at the beginning of the essentially ordered causal series. And so now we're kind of beginning argument number 2, wherein Aquinas uses some additional logic to attempt to prove what kind of God it is, whether it's good, whether it's omnipotent, stuff like that. But I think the initial discussion, I think we're kind of done with this video at this point. You guys can let me know in the comments if you want to play the rest of it out. But if I can point to a flaw in the argument of the existence of God, then all of the stuff that comes after that for, how powerful he is, or whether or not he's good, etc., or perfect, etc., kind of is immaterial. It's not something I need to worry about. But we can listen to it if you want. It's up to you guys. Kaysen, do you have any thoughts?
I have some. I'm still writing some stuff out. I have a couple pages below you, but
fair enough.
I'll get to it later.
Okay, so this is kind of the argument from Aquinas for the existence of God. This is kind of boiling everything down. Premise 1, change occurs, things change. Premise 2, things do not change themselves. Premise 3, change is an essentially ordered causal series, otherwise there would be an infinite regress. Conclusion, whatever the first thing is in that series, in that essentially ordered causal series, that's God. There are several problems with this argument. First of all, premise 2, things do not change themselves. We have to be careful with this. This is not something we can know for certain. I mean, I accept the premise for sure, because that's how most everything that I've seen and that we have seen, and I'm going to use the scientific we in this discussion, which is normally something, and it makes me cringe on the inside, but I mean, when I say the scientific we, I don't even know, how do I say that? Like, I don't like that, Kaysen, help me. I don't like, so many people when discussing science talking about what we know. I guess a better way of saying it would be scientific consensus, consensus of the data.
I'm still not sure what you're trying to communicate on this particular point. So say it poorly, and then we'll
say it
fix
poorly.
it later.
Caveat, asterisk, this is how I'm saying it poorly. We know almost nothing about the universe. And that's like, we in terms of scientists that have done inquiry and studies still have very small, in terms of the amount of knowledge that is out there about how things work and what exists everywhere, we know very, very little. So that's what I was trying to say, but I hate using the word we in that context because it collectivizes a lot of individual scientists. Yeah. They're
trying to think of a better way to say it, but
exactly, that's what I'm trying to do.
People's knowledge is very limited. I love seeing this. There was a little graphic of the way everything is, and then inside that, like the universe and all the knowledge that could be derived from the universe, and there's like a teeny tiny bubble inside of it, which is the collective amount of human information, and then there's like a little tiny bump on the edge, and it's like, this is your doctoral thesis, like this is the amount of exposition or exploration you can do in a lifetime. And it was just kind of an interesting like scale based on it seems like the more I learn about things, the more I know that I don't know about other things. Like the more I learn about audio and how it works just in the realm of audio equipment, the more I go, I really don't understand that much about audio, because I know only a very small subset that pertains to a very small set of things that I know about, you know?
Yeah, and I have a personal anecdote that's right along those lines as well. Like I used to, in the very beginning of this channel, my tagline under my name on all my social media profiles was, something like, crap, now I'm going to forget what it is. Can we pull up Float? Let's see.
Bullshit detector?
Not Governor.
I know that one.
We'll pimp Float again here. Come on, Float. Peaceful.
It
was peaceful dad, entrepreneur, liberty activist, bullshit detector, host of Disenthrall in the beginning. And I did not ever put philosopher in like my tagline because I hadn't really worked hard enough to study it. And then early on, when I had done a fair amount of work, I put philosopher in all of my taglines. Peaceful dad, entrepreneur, philosopher, liberty activist, bullshit detector. Because, I felt like, okay, I got this. I got a handle on the brunt, the breadth, the majority of the philosophy, at least around the silo that I'm working in. So, I mean, that makes me a philosopher, right? And then a while back, as I continue to learn, the main thing you learn as you study philosophy is just how much you have no idea about. And so I kind of went back and humility kind of kicked me in the balls, and now I call myself like a journeyman philosopher, which is really interesting. And we should maybe talk about what journeyman means. Like it's an actual system that used to exist where like an apprentice would study under somebody until they had learned as much that particular master could teach them, and then they were required to sort of go on a 2 to 3 year journey where they visited and stayed with and lived with for 6 months at a time other masters around the region of the world they had access to. And that was called a journeyman. Like you weren't a master yet, and you weren't an apprentice. You were a journeyman, and you were going out and you were learning as much as you could from as many different sources as possible. And I'm like, boom, that's exactly sort of where I'm at anyway. But yes, so like part of the process, what I was going with that is like just realizing how much we don't know. It's important. Okay. Anyway, so yeah, just provisionally, we can accept P2, but we have to be careful. There could certainly exist something somewhere that can change without somebody acting on it, or without something acting on it. And it would actually be fallacious to make an assumption that something could not be possible because we have not seen it. Just because we have not, the scientific whatever, just because we haven't seen something does not mean that it doesn't exist or that it's not possible. That would be fallacious. But all the data certainly lines up with things not being able to change themselves. So we'll leave that one alone for now. P3, change is and this is where all the problems happen. Change is an essentially ordered causal series, otherwise there would be an infinite regress. This is a summary of kind of what he's saying. First of all, the major fallacy committed here is argument by assertion. What is he asserting? Well, he's asserting that things function according to an essentially ordered causal series. He's asserting that we need there to not be an infinite regress. There's no evidence that it's not an infinite regress. There's no evidence that it's not an essentially ordered causal series yet. It seems to be that the intelligent position, at least on this question, is one of ignorance, of not knowing, of not having evidence either way. So to assume otherwise, to assume that we can't have an infinite regress, therefore it's an essentially ordered causal series, therefore there is a first mover, is a non sequitur. You're asserting that we can't have an infinite regress and therefore blah, blah, blah. In my notes, I said, why must this be an essentially ordered causal series? In fact, most of the data about reality indicates that it's an infinite causation chain with no evidence for a first mover. So there's a lot of, like, everything that we see, cause and effect, the law of what is it? The conservation of energy? No, it's the one where it says in any closed system, the amount of energy does not change. The energy only changes forms, matter only changes energy and back and forth. That is evidence
Conservation of energy?
Conservation of mass and energy, yeah. So that law, having never been shown to be violated, is evidence against this being an essentially ordered causal series. Because that means that there's nothing outside the system working on the system, which is what a first mover would be. And maybe we can continue listening if you guys want to. Later in the video, he talks about, because this person is a first mover, because this person has no potentialities to actualize, this God entity has no potentialities to actualize, that effectively means it can't really act. Because if it could act, then you would have a version of the God before he acted that had the potential of acting, and then after he actualized his potential of acting to act, he would now have changed, which is the antithesis of what a first mover is. It's got to be an unchanging entity, and for it to be unchanging also kind of means that it cannot act. So if anything, this would prove that this God entity cannot act in reality. So it can't be material. It can't be inside the time stream. It's sort of got to be outside the space-time continuum, to use Star Trek lingo. It's got to be outside of everything. It's got to be undetectable. And by nature of it being undetectable, it can't interact with any systems. And by virtue of it being a first mover that has no potentialities, it can't act anyway. But all of that comes afterwards, though. All of that comes after this premise that that reality is an essentially ordered causal series that must have a first mover. No evidence is provided for the existence of a first mover, other than to say, well, without it, it would be infinite regress. Well, for all of our experiences and all of our data, that's how things function via infinite regress. Energy moves and changes forms. Cue balls bounce together and head off in different directions. That's all the evidence points to it sort of being an infinite regress. The world does not function like an essentially ordered series. It functions like an infinite regress. So why should we entertain this hypothesis without any evidence presented for it? We've never seen, like I said earlier, we've never seen the law of conservation of energy broken, but that's exactly what an unmoved mover would look like. But an unmoved mover couldn't move anything. And everything might also be explained by something like a unified field theory of physics instead of a first mover. Everything, maybe we haven't even discovered how or what functions at the root of reality yet. It could be multiple things. Why assume that that there must be a first moving machine, and then why label the first moving machine God? All right. So those are my initial my problems with premise 3 is that it assumes that everything is an essentially ordered causal series because otherwise it would be an infinite regress. Why? Why can't it be an infinite regress? There's no evidence in the argument for that. And then the conclusion is the first thing in the series is God. Well, and this is where he's going to get into further arguments on, I guess, the attributes of the first mover. But even if we accept all three of these premises, even if we accept without question as true that existence is an essentially ordered causal series, and that it's not an infinite regress, and we assume and agree that there's a first mover, no evidence has been presented that this first mover is God. It's just sort of labeled God. Okay, you've attached a label to something that no evidence has been provided for. That certainly does not prove the existence of like the Catholic God or the Christian God, as opposed to the Muhammad God or some other conception of God. It could be any of these things. That's not part of this argument. Okay. Then I had some notes on Aristotle, and then I'll kick it to you, Case. And unless you had something,
before you carry on,
go ahead.
Yeah, for this. So assuming that all of the premises included right there are true, you have a Mott and Bailey going on right now by you kind of pointed out calling it God versus the God of Christian theology. Like to quote C.S. Lewis out of Mere Christianity, he's making an argument for the existence of God with no proofs from reality, only using logic. He in one of the chapters he says, "I am not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I've got to is," and then he restates his position. So really, all you've got to, assuming that everything here is correct. I'm not sure which one. The Mott is the more aggressive straw man, and the Bailey's like the safe position. To just rebrand it from the idea of, yeah, I'm not talking about the God of Christianity. I'm just talking about there is a God. We're just giving it the label of God. So I thought that was an interesting point, because so far, and I would like to listen to the rest of Tom's thing whenever you're ready, just because I wonder if he's going to try to tack something else onto it. That syncs it all together. I'm certainly curious as to whether or not that happens.
Well, he was right in the beginning when he said that Aquinas does a whole lot more work to figure out what other attributes of this first mover God can be reasoned with pure logic, basically. And yeah, we can play the rest of it. I just wanted to say a few more things. I had notes about the, Aristotelian physics that were kind of evoked here that I kind of talked about earlier. I did say that, if God is pure actual, he cannot actualize anything. He cannot act to create the world or to push a rock with a stick, much less sort of be the source of all change, which is something that was asserted earlier. Like, let's find it. This is why I like having notes, because I can refer back to contradictions. So, the universe could not continue in existence right now, and change could not occur right now without God keeping it in existence and being the source of change right now. So in his example of the hand and the stick and the rock, the hand is sort of the beginning force of the using the stick to push the rock. But that involves that person having the potentiality of pushing the rock with the stick using their hand. By definition, later, we know that God can't have potentialities. He is pure actuality. He just exists by this definition. So how can something that just exists with no potentialities and no ability to change be the source of change? How can something that can't push a rock be the beginning and link in the chain of pushing the rock? That seems to be contradictory in and of itself. Also, and this is kind of the final argument I'll make, and then we can listen to the rest of the video. But okay, let me just say this. So this whole discussion needs to be shown, it needs to be revealed to having erased Christianity's conception of free will. So if the source of change, of allowing you to be a tool that moves things and acts in the world, doesn't come from you, then you're not the prime mover. You're not the unmoving mover. You're not the first mover. So somebody else had to set that up. Somebody else set that in motion. You aren't the unmoved mover because you move. Something has to help move you. Well, God is the unmoved mover that moves you. And if this is an essentially ordered causal series sourced from him in the here and now, then you are not even choosing or acting to watch this video. You are the stick that God is using to push the rock. Is the stick culpable for who it hits? No, it's the person swinging the stick. You're the stick. This argument erases free will. I just wanted to kind of put the final check mark on this God question, Kason, if you have anything else before we listen to the rest of it. But as of right now in the video, the argument is kind of over. We've kind of shown the problem in the reasoning of the unmoving mover, the first mover, and anything else that we prove about God and about the unmoving mover is immaterial, but we can certainly listen to it just to see if we have any other thoughts.
Yeah, down to, I think it was like postulate number 2, where things cannot move themselves. It was down just, things do not change themselves. One of the rebuttals that I had early on was just humans. Because without the idea that humans can change themselves, like I think you've used the analogy of like humans are the computers that can change their programming, so to speak, and then run a different set of code through improving the tools inside of your toolkit whenever it comes to things like parenting or philosophy. Without that, that completely erases the idea of moral agency, which this is an argument from effect. But I think I think it becomes logically contradictory if somebody holds in one hand people ought to be held for their actions, and then in the other hand they hold the idea that no one has any moral agency via this argument. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, it's not an argument from effect if you also include in all the consequences of that to the Christian faith. Like, you can't be held culpable for a sin if you are not the source of your of actualizing your potentiality to commit that sin. So in that way, it's a contradiction. It erases culpability.
So yeah, that's all I got right now.
All right.
I'd love to know
There
if he
must
has any additional arguments.
All right, let's do it.
Be something that is pure act, that has no unactualized potentiality. I have to now show how this helps us understand the nature of God. So from the first way, Aquinas concludes two important things: the existence of God and God is pure act. Now he derives the following attributes, because sometimes you'll hear people say, well, why should...
And I think it's poor use of language to say that God is pure act, because what it should be is God is pure actual. Just act implies, the word act means like the ability to act. So to say that God is pure act is like almost synonymous sounding to, I guess, somebody that speaks modern English with saying that God is pure action. But that's not what's being said. It's pure actual. A pure actualization, not actualizing or acting towards any potentiality. Whew. Yeah, these words are weird because nobody talks about physics and stuff like this anymore.
Did you choose this god over that one? Why aren't you still worshiping Zeus or the ancient, the gods of ancient Greece or this or that? Well, Aquinas will give you an answer, and he'll say, for one thing, God has to be one. Monotheism must be true, Aquinas says, on the basis of this demonstration. So for every snarky person who says, well, I'm going to bring back the worship of Zeus and Apollo or whatever, he's going to dismiss this again in a 2-minute argument. But it's one that follows logically from God as pure act. He says, let's imagine, for the sake of argument, that there were more than one God. Well, if there's more than one of anything, there has to be some way in principle of distinguishing them. Right? I mean, think of anything you know. Think of two objects that you know. Compare them to each other. How can you compare them? How can you distinguish them from each other? One of them might be taller than another. One of them might be stronger or more powerful than another. There are all kinds of ways things can be different. But to distinguish two things, one of them must have at least one attribute that the other one doesn't have, right? So if you could have two things that are absolutely identical except one's taller than the other. Well, that's how you distinguish them. This one is this one and that one is that one. But what does it mean to lack a feature? To lack this degree of height? Lacking a feature is just an unrealized potentiality. Or you know what? Let's make it as difficult on ourselves as possible. Let's imagine two identical twins. And unless you know these identical twins very, very well, you really can't distinguish between them at all. And let's suppose they even had the same name. All right? But they are still two distinct beings. So how could you distinguish them? Well, you could distinguish them by the physical standing room they occupy. You could say, well, this one is on the left and that one is on the right. There's always something you...
I'm not an expert in Catholicism, so somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure the Catholics believe in the Trinity, the Holy Trinity, three parts of one whole. It would seem to me that there would be three. It seems to be there's some weirdness involved with trying to say that these three things with different attributes are this first unmoving mover.
Use to distinguish between two things, even if they're pretty much identical in every way. Well, here's the problem. If you lack a feature, if I lack power, let's say, if there's another human being who's stronger than I am, that means I have an unactualized potentiality. I have not fully actualized my potential to be strong. Or if there's a dish with a cold egg on it and a dish with a hot egg, well, then the dish with the cold egg has not fully actualized its potentiality to be hot. But when we're dealing with God, we're dealing with a being that has no unactualized potentiality. So even when you have two identical twins standing next to each other, one of them's on the left and one of them's on the right. And the one who's on the right has not fully actualized his potential or her potential to be on the left. But God has no unactualized potentialities. And yet unactualized potentialities are the only way in principle we can distinguish between two things. So therefore, there is no way in principle to distinguish two gods. So therefore, there cannot be two gods. Monotheism follows directly from God as pure act. Likewise, God is immaterial because he's pure act, because being a material thing involves changeability. And remember, a purely actual being cannot be changeable, cannot have unactualized potentialities, where he can move from being one way to being another way and change. A purely actual, pure act, if you're pure act, you can't change. Change involves moving from potency to act, and you have no potency. Well, think of, to help understand this part of the argument, think of any material thing you're familiar with. It could be the human body, obviously changes. But even just think about something like a desk, and even apart from natural decay, you can chop up a desk and rearrange it. If you wanted to, you could make a work of modern art out of it. You could chop it up and rearrange those parts. It's changeable by definition. And God can't be changeable, because changeability involves moving from being potentially something to actually. So God can't be material, so he can't be a spaghetti monster. So we rule that out. Likewise, God would have to be outside of time and space. Being inside time and space likewise entails changeability. Now, Aristotle thinks about time as existing only where you have change. Time is the measure of change. But God can't change. He's utterly outside that whole framework of changeability. Now, if that's too abstract for you, think of it this way. When you move through time, you are moving from potentiality to actuality. If it's 3:30 in the afternoon, and then it becomes 3:31 in the afternoon, you have now actualized your potential to be in existence at 3:31 in the afternoon. Whereas before, at 3:30 in the afternoon, you had not fully actualized your potential to be at 3:31. So you moved, as you go through time, you're moving from potency to act. God has no potency to actualize. He has no unactualized potentiality, so God's outside time. God is all-powerful. This likewise follows from God as pure act. How does it follow? Well, we make reference to another Aristotelian principle. A cause cannot give what it does not have.
I just want to point out another possible contradiction. You know, if this God, unmoving mover, exists and is omnipotent, then, but does not and cannot change himself or act in the world, because acting would be actualizing a potentiality, how can you call something that literally can't do anything omnipotent? Isn't that the antithesis of omnipotence? Like a complete inability to do anything? How is that omnipotence?
So the cause of a feature must possess that feature either formally or eminently. Formally, in the case of a lighted torch that sets a stack of papers on fire. That lighted torch, it basically is fire with a handle. It's not really a torch when it's blown out. Okay, so that is fire, and that fire is then imparted to the papers. But eminently, in the case of a cigarette lighter, which is not itself on fire all the time, it's not necessarily on fire, but it has the ability to produce fire, and thereby can convey fire. Well, if the unmoved mover, the first mover, is the source of all change, as Aquinas has demonstrated, if he is the source of things coming to have the attributes they have, from going from potentially some way to being actually that way, then God himself would have to possess all these attributes himself, because a cause cannot give what it does not have. And if God actualizes all these potentialities to be certain ways, God would also have to have those certain ways. He would have to have those powers himself, and that means God would have to be all-powerful. God would have to possess...
The torch example sort of reveals the ancientness of the physics words that we're using. If a cause cannot give that which it does not have, then a lighter cannot give fire or heat because the lighter doesn't have any. It has gas, and it's got flint that makes a spark. And when you combust the gas, it generates heat that wasn't there before, which then would heat the paper to the point that it itself combusts into heat that was not there before. And if the paper is then used to light a log on fire, then the heat being emitted from the paper did not come from the gas in the lighter. You can see how this language that is being used just doesn't describe reality accurately with our current level of knowledge on how things work. It's because this is old and out. This is Aristotelian physics. I mean, he was a smart guy, but he just didn't know a lot of the stuff that we know about how things work.
Possess an intellect and a will for the same reason. Because if human beings have intellects and wills, God must possess these attributes as well. Since he is the cause of them coming to have these things, a cause can't bestow something it does not have itself. Now finally, God is perfect and all good.
This seems to contradict and discount like emergent behavior, and a great example of that would be like an airplane wing. Like a bunch of aluminum atoms can clump together and not have the ability to fly, but if they clump together in the right shape, then they gain the ability to fly, which is something that they didn't, that none of the individual aluminum atoms possessed on their own. Just for one example.
Now what about the claim that, well, if God has all features perfectly, then wouldn't he have all negative features perfectly too? Wouldn't he be perfectly blind, perfectly stupid? But the answer here is that these are actually privations. These are not positive features in their own right. Blindness is simply...
Privations means absence of something. So he's saying that those words indicate the absence of an attribute, not an actual attribute.
Simply a lack, perfectly blind, perfectly stupid. But the answer here is that these are actually privations. These are not positive features in their own right. Blindness is simply a lack of sight. Stupidity is simply a lack of knowledge. So these things are privations. They're not positive features.
Continue. We'll continue.
If God possesses every perfection and is therefore perfect and all good, how do we show this through knowing that he's pure act? And the answer is that having a perfection involves actualizing a potentiality.
Okay, a perfection is another word from the ancient times, which is to say a positive attribute. So a perfection would be a positive attribute. And the more positive attributes that you have, the more perfections that you have, the more perfect you are.
Well, knowing that he's pure act. And the answer is that having a perfection involves actualizing a potentiality. Well, the unmoved mover, from which all such features derive, is purely actual and has no unactualized potentiality. So therefore, he must enjoy all these attributes absolutely perfectly. Otherwise, there would be a potential that's unactualized, but there is no unactualized potential in a being that is pure act.
So he's basically saying that God possesses only positive attributes. He possesses all attributes, but the positive ones only. Because the negative ones that would make someone evil, those are the absences of attributes.
So that is at least an introductory overview of one of the ways that Western theism has approached the idea of understanding God and demonstrating the existence of God and figuring out what his attributes must be. Whew. Okay, well, that took a lot out of me to go through that. I hope you found that helpful and interesting. I hope you find the whole show helpful and interesting. I'll refer you to a couple of sources.
Okay, so that's the end of the video. There are some YouTube channels, for example, just for there's certainly like a lot of publications and a lot of writing on the topics rebutting the arguments that he did. But there's even YouTube channels and YouTube videos out there that with literally one or two searches, he could have found the counter arguments and the countermanding evidence to the arguments that he put forward today from this book. And so for him to criticize people for making arguments about spaghetti monsters without having first done their research into his position, then why hasn't he done research into the counter arguments that are pretty blatantly clear and obvious as to why this argument for the existence of God is an invalid argument, an argument by assertion, for example. I would point that out as another contradiction. Like the information is not buried away in tomes and dusty, library somewhere. Like there's entire YouTube channels that have devoted themselves to addressing arguments exactly like this one. Really easy to find. Okay, that's all I have to say on this video. If anybody has any questions or comments or thinks I went wrong in my criticisms, let me know. Otherwise, I'll toss it to Kaysen.
Yeah, so something I noticed in the description of Tom Wood's video is that it's a rebuttal to the flying spaghetti monster nonsense floating about, I think was the language used in the description of it. Well, he's talking about people's belief in the Church of the Flying Spaghetti Monster as though it's a physical being, like flying is an actualization of the potential of flying, and spaghetti is the actualization of matter. But I think the point behind FSM, or Flying Spaghetti Monster,
is that a known acronym? FSM?
Yeah, FSM, Church of FSM. Yeah, Flying Spaghetti Monster.
I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah, is kind of like Bertrand Russell's teapot, where it's like, I don't necessarily have evidence. It would be kind of silly to say that there isn't a China teapot orbiting between like Earth and Mars.
Yeah, go ahead and explain for people that don't know about the teapot what that is.
Yeah. So basically, so people were asking Bertrand Russell about like atheism and agnosticism, and he says something like the Christian God is not necessarily any more probable than like the gods of like Greek Olympus, or that nobody could prove that between Earth and Mars is like a China teapot revolving in an orbit, like it's the 4 point or the third and a half planet is actually a China teapot.
Yeah, it's something that could be possible, but that there's absolutely no evidence for.
Yeah. So he says, I should call myself an agnostic, but really in all actuality, I'm an atheist. Well, in the same way, I think that the concept behind flying spaghetti monster belief, or Pastafarianism, if you're in the know, would be hang on, I actually have a note here. Oh yeah, down on page. Scroll down a little bit. You'll see my notes.
Oh, wow. Look at all these
Flying
notes.
Spaghetti Monster. So Flying Spaghetti Monster, he was talking literally versus like a parody to demonstrate the burden of proof for like a non-falsifiable claim. Because there's literally no way to disprove the existence of the flying spaghetti monster as defined within Pastafarianism, that he's outside of time, he's outside of space, he's the prime mover in all things. There is no way to disprove that. Kind of like Eric the God-eating penguin. I think that was sent to me by our buddy Yos. I'm going to go grab this image and share it. It's an unfalsifiable claim. So this is a fallacy. Center share. If you could put me full, please. God can't exist because of Eric the God eating magic penguin. Since Eric is God eating by definition, he has no choice but to eat God. So if God exists, he automatically ceases to exist as a result of being eaten. Unless you can't prove that Eric doesn't exist, God doesn't exist. Even if you can prove that Eric doesn't exist, that same proof will also be applicable to God. There are only two possibilities. Either you can prove that Eric exists or that you can't. In both cases, it logically follows that God doesn't exist. That's the kind of the argument levied by Pastafarians. I guess there are actual like Pastafarians out there who have to have a genuine belief, because without that, you can't have certain tax write-offs, I would assume. But for those that treat it as a satire, it's a great thought experiment for like, how would a believer in any religion disprove the flying spaghetti monster? They literally can't. Because if they could, that same logic would be used to dismantle their own belief. Assuming it's built on a similar premises. Outside of time, prime mover, can't detect through sense data, etc. Compared to like Olympians, where it's like, they live on top of that mountain.
Yeah, but according to Aquinas, it can't be spaghetti because that would be matter that would not exist outside of time and space.
That's what his noodly appendage-ness has deemed his name to be, in the same way that you have deemed God's name to be God.
Okay, all right.
It's just a label, a conceptual tag.
I'm done arguing against the spaghetti monster. Yeah, so I guess I'll just close out this segment by reiterating the sort of keystone that I pulled out of this argument, which was that there is nothing saying that causality, even in the here and now, not talking temporally. Why wouldn't you talk temporally? Because anyway, but let's just assume that we're not talking temporally. Even now, there's nothing showing that that this stuff is not an infinite regress. And no evidence was presented either in this video or in this argument or by Aquinas or Aristotle, to my knowledge, that things are not an infinite, that things don't function, that reality doesn't function in an infinite regress of causality. That is just something that was asserted because he basically said it a couple times in the video. Because if it's not, then it's going to be an infinite regress. And we don't want it to be an infinite regress. Therefore, essentially ordered causal series. Therefore, there's got to be an unmoving mover or an unmoved mover. Well, sorry, it could be an infinite regress. I'm open to evidence to the contrary. So that is my conclusion. That is my destruction of Tom Woods. No, I'm just kidding. If I've got it wrong, dude, I would love to have the conversation. If somebody has a counter argument to that, I'm open. I enjoy good discussions and debates. Let me know. And I think we have somebody over on Float that wants to debate the God question with me in the near future. I have no idea what angle he's going to take, but dude, I'm always looking for good conversation. So if you have one, you can do it politely and respectfully and intelligently. Contact me. All right. Anything else, Kaysen?
Nah, I think I'm good.
Ben Shapiro, Rex Libtard. Yeah! Oh, nice. Are you a Pastafarian?
No, I'm just sporting some new headgear. We'll see where this goes.
Voluntary Dan says, not governor. What would it take for you to change your mind on the existence of God? Evidence. Show me some evidence. Show me some evidence of God.
What would constitute valid evidence for the existence of a God? Because I talked through this with a gentleman the other day. He's a believer, and he said, "What would you consider valid evidence?" And I said, "So if you had an amputee and a person that prayed over that amputee, and that amputee spontaneously grew new limbs, that would be the start of it. But that still, as C.S. Lewis says, that doesn't put us necessarily within 100 miles of the God of Christianity." And that's like miraculous, like what miracle could be performed.
Yeah, and I try not to use this in arguments, but we're not in a debate, so I can use it, voluntary Dan. If we were debating, I would not say this because it's sort of emotionally manipulative, but it's not intended to be. It's just my honest answer to your question. What would it take for me to change my mind in the existence of God? My 3-year-old daughter not having come down with blood cancer. So there is no way in which God can be, what are the big three? And I think Aquinas actually has a big
All
five.
powerful.
The 5 attributes of God, right? Omnipotent, omniscient,
Omnipresent.
omnipresent, but omni-good. I forgot what the word for good is. Omni-good, all good.
Omnibenevolent.
Benevolent, thank you. And there's one more. Anyway, the ones I care about are omniscient, omnipotent, and omnibenevolent, all good. There's no way those 3 things can exist and my 3-year-old can get blood cancer. Like, there is no way. And this goes to sort of the fundamental root break in the logic of God for me is those 3 attributes. So if God is omnipotent and omniscient, then he knew exactly how this universe was going to play out the moment he created it. You can't say he didn't know, otherwise he's not omniscient. You can't say he didn't have the power to dial in the universe exactly as it rolled out without saying that he's not omnipotent. And you can't say that he's all good if, with all ultimate power and ultimate knowledge, he created a universe in which kids die of blood cancer. So those 3 things are logically self exclusive. Those 3 attributes cannot be said to all be about the same person. They can't either be they can't be all powerful, all good, and all knowing, and for little kids to die of cancer. He's either evil and all powerful and all knowing. He's either all powerful and ignorant, meaning he created the universe without knowing how it was going to roll out, in which you could still say he's all good. He just doesn't know what's going on. I don't think anybody's saying that. You could say that he's not all powerful, but he's all knowing and good. And then, in which case, why would you create suffering? I'm not sure that's all good. Like you can slice that pie in any direction, including or excluding any of the attributes you want, and it doesn't result in a universe where kids die of blood cancer. And again, like, that's my personal life story based answer to your question. If God exists, he's evil, or ignorant, or impotent. What were you about to say, Kason?
Yeah, this has been a problem for, well, I guess since the inception of the idea, the problem of evil. If God is good, why would evil show up? And I haven't seen any apologetic or specific rebuttal from any particular faith that resolves that.
Well, I mean, it also erases free will, which is the one of the fundamental planks in any religious faith, is that you're responsible for your actions in the afterlife. But if God is omniscient and omnipotent and whatever, well, we can even ignore all good for right now. Well, no. If he's all good, that includes 2. So if he's omniscient, omnipotent, and all good, he, like I said, he knew exactly the order to put atoms in to roll the universe out in exactly the way it rolled out. That means that you're not making your decisions because he knew he designed them up front deterministically. And he knew in advance up front what you were going to do. And let's say that free will exists and, something about how he designed the universe allowed you to change his design in a way that he didn't predict. He would have still known what you were going to change and what you were going to do. And if that involved sin, then he still designed that sin into existence. Is that all good? Don't think so. Again, these 3 attributes are sort of exclusive with one another. They just don't work. It just doesn't work. Free will doesn't even exist. It just doesn't work.
There is, you were saying that free will is the cornerstone of many of the world religions, or I think any. There is a subset of Christians that subscribe to a belief called Calvinism, which is that there is predestination. Like there's 5 main components to it that basically man falls into sin. They call that like total depravity or total inability. Unconditional election, which means that basically God, outside of time, elected those who he will have reconciled to him through some form or another. And then there's a couple other things, but basically the idea is, because I know a couple Calvinists that I've talked to about the concept of free will, and they're like, no, that's not a thing. I've yet to talk to one that says that free will is a thing, because everything is actually we are the machinery or the cogs in the machine of God. Like every action that is taken was predetermined before you ever existed. Which
Zachary Cowley says
is-
he's a Calvinist, and that's what you were just talking about, right? So, like, inform me further. I'm curious. What do you mean by what is a Calvinist? I'm not educated on this.
So, I was an Arminianist, so they were our enemies, so to speak,
Oh,
whenever
shit.
it comes to theology.
Are we gonna need guns for this?
But rather than... No, I don't think so. And really, I would love, Zachary, if you want to jump on and have a chat. I don't know if we can...
yeah, I can
get him
fire
on
up Skype if you want.
Is that...
Yeah, it's doable.
Yeah, hey, Zach, if you want to join on Skype, hop on. Because my knowledge of Calvinism from the people that I've talked to is that there is no free will, that everything is predetermined and preordained from God, from before creation. Like, when God said, let there be, all of everything was set into motion. Like, what's that? Determinism. It's like the idea of determinism, but inside of a religious context rather than like the Sam Harris physical context.
Well, it would have had to have been that way. Even if God could have just been said to like close his eyes and create the universe, like he was still omnipotent, which means he could have created or not created the suffering that exists. And he still had the ultimate knowledge that even when he closed his eyes, he still knew what he was doing. You can't say that anyway. I'm repeating myself now. Sorry. Interesting. I didn't know the Calvinist thing.
Yeah, it's probably, before spouting off on it, it'd probably be worthwhile of a refresher course on it and to see what people actually believe versus what, like, I don't know, 13 or 1400s AD people believe, because that would be like, I don't know. I don't want to ascribe things that people are not currently doing to a group, because I'm no collectivist.